Hello, so now we're going to continue talking about behavioral assessment, and we had left off right at the beginning of descriptive assessment. So I'm going to take us from there. Descriptive assessment adds the component of direct observation. It's observation of the behavior in the natural setting in which the behavior is being demonstrated. Data are collected about events that precede the behavior, about the behavior itself, and about events that follow the behavior. It's often called ABCs. One way to do this is to collect antecedent behavior and consequence data in columns. So we talk about what happened right before the behavior, what was the actual behavior, and what happens after the behavior. The data that are gathered are used to help treatment teams understand the function of the behavior. And by recording a variety of instances in an ABC framework, we can look at patterns. And that gives us a lot more information for hypothesis development and for hypothesis testing, essentially. So in ABC data, we talk about, well, what is it that happened right before the behavior happened? It could be any event that happened just before it, told students to line up for recess, told students to put work away, took out math worksheet, asked student to go work with Miss So-and-so. And it could be presentations of demands, it could be a deprivation of attention, turned my attention to reading group B. For example, would be another indication that maybe deprivation of attention was an indicator there. So any of those environmental factors at an antecedent level could be an important piece of us trying to understand just why a behavior is occurring. For the behavior, again, you're going to want a very clear operational definition of the behavior. You're going to want to make sure that, in fact, you've got it well defined. It's perfectly clear to me or to anyone else who enters the room whether that's happened. And that description could be compiled from previous assessment measures, interviews, other kinds of observation, and we might be defining levels of the behavior as well, a serious aggression, a moderate aggression, a mild aggression, all of which could be operationally defined and used in terms of definitions. And the consequence is going to be what occurred immediately following the behavior. Is there a consistent response to the behavior? What did the learner gain? So did they get a brief reprieve from work? Did they get attention in the form of reprimands, or did the teacher come over and help calm them? Were they given access to preferred items? Were they given a squishy ball to help calm down? Were they told to go work on the computer? Were they ignored? Were they redirected to some activity? Again, I mentioned this point already, but it's really important in this context to understand that what we're doing here is not evaluating staff behavior. This is not a staff observation evaluation tool. This is just a way for us to delineate what's actually happening in the environment. So, and that's important for staff to understand. Just write what happened. Just write what you did. Don't worry about whether that's the correct thing or the incorrect thing. We're trying to understand what might be happening for this learner, and so accuracy is our number one goal in this context. Here's an example of a sample ABC data sheet that could be used where it has the date, the initials, the time, and the setting, and just columns for the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. This is one from one setting, but there are millions of examples of these out there, and these are just ways for staff to track what's going on in the environment. This is another one that's a little bit really designed just to help people have quick check-offs. So if you were doing something about voice volume for a learner who spoke either above or below normal hearing levels, you might want to track what activity were they in, what was the speaking level, and what the consequence was. Were they sent to a chair, which was a strategy that was being used for that learner? Was appropriate language modeled? Were they ignored, etc.? So sometimes you have a particular behavior you're zeroing in on, and you're just trying to track very specifically little aspects of it. So you could have a modified ABC data sheet that's prepared to make it easy for staff to zero in on those few variables. And the way we interpret data from this level of descriptive assessment is generally to take the total number of problem behaviors and divide it by the number of antecedent or consequent events. So here's an example. You've got Billy, 20 instances of aggression, and you look for the conditional probabilities that are associated with the antecedents. 16 of the 20 were preceded by task presentation. That's 80%. 2 were preceded by a deprivation of attention. That's 10%. 1 by restricted access to preferred items, and 1 was unknown. And then we can graph it. In this particular case, and not all data are like this, and not all behavior problems present this way, but in this case, it's quite clear that demands are a very important antecedent to aggression for this particular individual. You could do the same thing with the consequences. We did that with the antecedents. Now, consequences, all we're doing is bringing together all those data from all those instances that were tracked by staff. Maybe 14 of them were followed by a brief break from tasks. 70% of the time, staff said, okay, take a minute and calm yourself down. 8 of them were followed by a reprimand. That's 40%. 6 were followed by a change in task. So you want to do something different? Let's try your sorting, right? And 2 were ignored. And that gives us something that looks like this. And it adds up to more than 100% because sometimes staff are doing more than one thing, right? And that's common. And so we see a lot of what's being done, mostly staff are giving a break. And that helps us with hypothesis testing and generation. So we're saying, okay, 80% of the time it's preceded by a demand, and 70% of the time it works to get a break from demands. So that tells us something about possibly the MOs, the circumstances that are occurring for that individual before they engage in the behavior, and the consequences that might be inadvertently maintaining it. All hypothesis driven. So some of the advantages of descriptive assessment, hugely advantageous over some of the indirect and interview methods in a couple of ways. It's observing the behavior in the natural context. And I spoke about this already, but I have to underscore. As behavior analysts, we value direct observation. We worry about indirect methods and methods that are not based on real samples of behavior. We know that they're subject to bias. We know that they're subject to biases from people that are completely well-meaning and unaware of their biases. As human beings, we have a tendency to overemphasize certain instances we've personally observed and to add that to our understanding of it. It might not be the complete story for what's going on with that behavior. It is such a good idea to base our impressions of function on data rather than on anecdotal observations, and it's really important that we do so. That is what leads to effective interventions. If we get the function wrong, we almost always have a treatment plan that will be ineffective. We need to get the function correct. Some of the disadvantages to descriptive assessment or direct observational measures are we're still not manipulating antecedents and consequences. So we don't necessarily have a really good sense of functional relations. We're not saying we did this and then this happened. We're still just observing it in the natural context. Now that's not necessarily a disadvantage, and often we get plenty of very clear and interpretable data from a descriptive assessment of this type. But sometimes we require going to the next level, which involves actual manipulation of variables. Some other disadvantages: several things might occur at the same time. I showed you some real nice data there, right? 80% of the time it was escape motivated. Very often we get 50% this and 50% that, or 40% this and 60% that. Or things seem to co-occur, and it's very difficult for us to tease it apart. Like, so is it escape or is it attention? Is it both? Is it sometimes one and sometimes the other? Much tougher kinds of situations for us to tease apart and to develop a plan around. And so descriptive assessment doesn't always help us with that level. Before I go on to functional analysis, a couple of other things I'm going to say about descriptive assessment. ABC analysis is the most common kind of functional assessment, direct observational measure that we do, a descriptive assessment. There are other kinds of descriptive assessments that people do. Sometimes they'll have someone come in and just do a narrative of everything that's going on. And from that, we could do some hypothesis generation. That is more labor intensive and is something that generally requires an independent observer, whereas the ABC data can be collected by classroom staff. However, sometimes it's really helpful, even when doing ABC analyses, to have either IOA, inter-observer agreement, so another person collecting data to see if they would agree on what happened before and after, or an independent person collecting even those ABC data. So those are decisions that can be made on an individualized basis. The most common form of descriptive assessment is, in fact, the ABC chart. It's a great idea to make sure that with the ABC chart, what you do is then take the conglomeration of many different instances and code it for function, and then come up with overall what you have in terms of a primary or a secondary function. So much of the time, doing some kind of preliminary indirect measure or interview combined with some kind of direct observation is plenty. And we have clear functions, and we're confident, and they're congruent. So what we hypothesized in the interview actually came out on the ABC. Those are wonderful circumstances and common. Sometimes, though, we're still at a loss, and we need to do a higher level of functional assessment called functional analysis. Now, it isn't true that you always need to do functional analysis, but it is true that you sometimes do. Some of the circumstances we would consider it in is when you've done all of these analyses up until now and you do not have a clear function. You either have multiple high-level functions or just a complete mishmash where you can't make head nor tail out of anything. If you have very high rate behaviors, you may have elevations on everything, because an ABC chart would say, yeah, sometimes he does it when he's completely alone, sometimes he does it when demands are presented, sometimes he does it when he's attention deprived. If you have something that's happening 70% of the day, all of those things are going to look elevated on an ABC chart. So certain kinds of behaviors also lead us to functional analyses more often than not, including high rate behaviors. And it is true that some behaviors are genuinely multifunction. Even if they originally had an initial function, they may take on additional functions over time, and that makes it more difficult to tease out. So functional analysis is a technology that exists for behavior analysis in which we systematically manipulate environmental antecedents and consequences to help determine the functions of behavior. Iwata did the seminal article, and his colleagues did the seminal article on that, and Carr and Durand have also talked a tremendous amount about related issues. But it builds upon already gathered data. You don't go right to functional analysis. We will do the interview, the direct observation, the ABC, and then when all of that fails us, we consider doing a functional analysis. It's widely studied and used in the behavior analysis literature. There were 575 published studies in it in 2003. Since 1982, 96% of them resulted in usable outcomes. 70% with children, 91% of them were children with some kind of disability. Less than 3% used teachers as therapists. Hence, one of the issues. It is not a technology that's as easily transmittable to less skilled clinicians. There are inherent complexities to doing FAs that require a specialized skill set. The purpose of it is to arrange simple test conditions or conditions that are representative of contingencies that are common in the natural environment. Specific antecedents and consequences are manipulated, and the effects on behavior are observed. And you compare target behaviors across conditions. And those, hopefully, what we get at the end of a functional analysis is that different conditions or situations are associated with different levels of the problem behavior. And it gives us a more detailed understanding of the function of the behavior. One of the things that's a little bit strange about functional analysis is that we behave in ways that we would not ordinarily behave. It's very unnatural in terms of the consequences we administer for various kinds of behavior. And that is one of the reasons why you have to have someone with supervised experience in FA, leading, training, and providing ongoing support to the team. It's also the case that functional analysis can be quite unpredictable and can evoke very dangerous levels of behavior. So it's not always appropriate, especially in an environment in which safety is a significant factor. But depending on the reported concerns, you could have some or all of the following kinds of conditions. There's often a control condition, an ignore or alone condition in which really nothing's being done except the person is being allowed to do as they wish. But then the ones that we'd be most concerned with would be attention, tangible, and demand. In the attention condition, at an antecedent level, they're deprived of attention. And as a consequence, they're presented with attention contingent on the target behavior. Here's what I was talking about. It's quite different from what you would ordinarily do. We don't do that, even when we're trying to figure out the functions of behavior in natural settings. So this is highly unusual that you would attend to a behavior that you're trying to eradicate on purpose to try to tease out whether attention is a maintaining factor. So the therapist is very preoccupied, busy reading. They're expected to play quietly with toys, the individual that you're working with, and the therapist shifts their attention following maladaptive behavior. So the individual engages in self-injury, and the therapist stops ignoring, turns to them, provides attention, and says, please don't hit yourself. Oh, stop doing that. Please calm down, honey. So if they engage in high rates of inappropriate behavior in the condition, it indicates that social attention might function as a reinforcer for that maladaptive behavior. In the tangible condition, same idea is going to come through in all of these. As a consequence, they're presented with preferred items contingent on the target behavior. So they engage in self-injury, we hand them the koosh ball or whatever it is, the items that they most want. So we take away those preferred toys or leisure materials from the individual and return them just following the occurrence of the maladaptive behavior. And that tells us that if in fact we get high rates in this condition, that access to preferred items might be maintaining inappropriate behavior. In the demand condition, at an antecedent level, we present instructional demands, and as a consequence, we remove those instructional demands contingent on the behavior. So we say it's time to do math, and they hit us, and we say, oh, you don't want to do math right now? Okay. Again, you're probably reacting saying, what? Especially because as a clinician, you're thinking, I won't do that because I have a hypothesis here. But this is an assessment. This is not a treatment. We are trying to figure out what the maintaining factors are, and we're manipulating antecedents and consequences to drill that down and to get to the exact function. So they're prompted to complete a non-preferred task. The task is removed and they're given a short break following the occurrence of a maladaptive behavior, and this helps us determine whether non-preferred activities function as reinforcement for maladaptive behavior. In the alone or ignore condition, it's a barren environment with nothing programmed into it, and we do not interact with them. And that tells us that possibly there's an automatic reinforcement function. So if we're in that environment, we're not interacting with them, we're responding to nothing, we're providing nothing, then essentially it's possible that if high rates of the behavior occur, it's independent of any kind of social mediation, and it's an automatically reinforced behavior. In the toy or play condition, there's a lot of access to attention, toys, and nothing negative presented, and we don't react to the behaviors themselves. It's just an individual and the therapist playing together with preferred items, and they have access to all kinds of things that they would want and no demands. And it's designed essentially to be like an enriched environment. It's just a control condition, like everything is good and we're not manipulating other aspects of things. So let's talk a little bit about functional analysis procedures. Ideally, these are 10-minute sessions, but they can be shortened if necessary. 10 minutes is a very long time for high-level behaviors. So in recent years, there's been studies that have done 5-minute sessions, even 2-minute sessions. And those are considerably more viable in some settings than 10-minute conditions. Generally, we randomly select conditions, but you run each condition at least twice, and there are short breaks between those sessions, and the data are collected by an observer. The lights just went out, but I hope you can still see me. And then we graph it. And we would have sessions by responses per minute. And here's an example of what that might look like in a very nice functional analysis, which gives us a very clear primary function of attention. You can see how low all of the levels of behavior are except in the attention condition. Here's what it would look like in a demand condition. Again, everything low except escape. Tangible, everything low except tangible. Multi-operant. Okay, here, this is a little bit more confusing. We've got both tangible and attention elevated. We might have multiple significant functions there. And here's something that might happen in automatically maintained behavior where it's really just all over the place. Nothing seems to really make a difference. And so it's harder to interpret in that context. So some common questions or concerns. Behaviors can occur at higher rates in more than one condition, and that can be problematic. Sometimes the behavior never occurs. So you do these conditions and nothing happens. Or they don't seem to represent situations where the behavior is likely to occur. One of the problems with these are they're so analog that they really can be quite different from anything that actually happens in the natural environment. Sometimes that's an impediment to generalizability of the findings. Sometimes we can't run multiple sessions consecutively because we can't take the child out of their experiences or their activities at school for long enough. And so we don't get enough samples close in time. Sometimes we don't have good items to use. So that makes it difficult. If we don't have preferred items, it makes it hard to really ensure that we're withholding access to preferred items or providing reinforcers upon behavior. Or sometimes we get a lot of variability within the session. Criticisms, and there are many. It's very time-consuming to conduct the analyses. Teachers without special training cannot conduct the analysis. With special training, they can, but more so in specialized settings than in public school settings. And it does require a lot of training time. Brief models have come up. And I think I mentioned some of this. Some are using 5-minute or even 2-minute sessions. And some only do hypothesis-driven ones. Like, we're only interested in escape and attention. We know those are this kid's issues from all the previous levels of analysis. We don't necessarily have to run all the other conditions. We could run just those two. And teachers have been shown to be able to conduct functional analyses, and it's much less disruptive to the child's overall education if we do that. It has possibly better ecological validity because these are people in their real world settings, and it's closer to the referral concern. It's even better if we could do it in the classrooms. But it does require some teacher training. Same kinds of things we know about training in other contexts: written instructions, video modeling, hands-on training with feedback. And maybe if we taught more teachers to do these things, we would need outside consultants less. Others have said we can do it within normal routines. We can do it in the classrooms. That would be tremendously advantageous. That we could do a latency assessment instead of a rate. We could do number of seconds to the first instance in this condition. And therefore, we don't have an individual who's aggressing 10 times. We have an individual who aggresses once. But if we find that in escape situations, it happens within 10 seconds of the start of the interval, and in all the others, it doesn't happen until 90 seconds or more, that tells us something about the power of that antecedent level motivator. We can also do an FCT assessment. So we could teach individuals, and when you take the ABA courses, you'll learn more about this, but we could teach individuals to mand for a request for attention, to mand for escape, and we could look at their FCT responses that they use in these sessions instead of at their aberrant behavior, which is really cool because now we're looking at positive behavior and adaptive behavior and the rate of that instead of at the maladaptive behaviors. The bottom line risk assessment is this necessary? If you're perfectly clear on function, it's not necessary, as long as you've used direct observation as part of your assessment. If we're unclear, it might be necessary. But you have to make sure you've got safeguards in place for any time you're going to do FA. The next thing we're going to talk about is how do we apply these results in the context of treatment. And that's really important because behavioral assessment really is only important because it leads to behavioral treatment. This is, again, a very quick overview. When you take the courses that really look in this in detail, you'll watch sessions of people doing these different conditions. That's not the function of our overview of behavioral assessment. I just want to hit it in the context of Broadly, when we talk about assessment and diagnosis, it's impossible in the realm of autism not to talk about functional assessment and FA. So this is a broad introduction to some of those issues involved in our analysis of the functions of challenging behavior. But I don't expect you to have gleaned exactly how we do all of those things. I am going to put up a couple of those charts that could be used as informant methods for you folks to look at. But you will have whole courses that are designed to equip you with all the skill set as well as practicum experiences in your training that will give you those skills. This is just an overview of some of the main points and rationales for why we look so significantly at function. I hope that helps, and I'll talk to you real soon about treatment. Thanks.